Who's good at drawing stuff? You're good at drawing stuff. And when you draw stuff real good, you are not just, remember what we said? You're not just, or did we say this? You're not just communicating your brilliant ideas. You are communicating your brilliant ideas, but that's the second most important thing you're doing when you draw stuff. The most important thing you're doing when you draw stuff is what? Yeah, you're figuring it out, right? That's the power of what we do in architecture school, is we train you to see the world through the privileged lens, this powerful set of tools for making sense of the world that your parents, you're going to see things that your parents just don't see unless they're architects or designers or draw. The power of these architectural methods for making sense of the world, unlocking possibilities and developing those possibilities towards a proposal, that is what you uniquely are empowered to do. And it starts with making sense of the world. That's what you've been doing in studio. That's what we're going to do here. We're just going to be more explicit about it, right? You're giving me this look that, what is he talking about, right? My professors never talked like this. Does this sound familiar from studio at all? A little bit? If Shanique and Jackie were here, they would hopefully recognize it. Melvin, you recognize it, right? You recognize this, right? Old stuff, freshman year stuff, right? So we're making sense of the world. So that's what the analysis is going to be. You picking something that seems important, a little bit confusing, and you're going to work it through your tools of active engagement through drawing to make sense of it, right? How many people are comfortable using Photoshop? Anyone not comfortable using Photoshop? Not comfortable. Who's going to help him? Okay. Or use a highlighting pen. For me, the hand is actually so much more precise than the mouse, unless it's not. But it's so much faster, right? The hand is fast and precise. That's what I'm saying. So as we go along, you're going to see a few images on the screen that have been worked. And these are examples of what we expect you to do with the analysis. So the author of the reading is closely related to the presenter of this lecture. So it wouldn't be surprising that the first thing you did in the sketch writing, which was to capture the structure of ideas, wouldn't be surprising if the structure of ideas in that reading mapped somehow more or less to the structure of ideas in this presentation. Although that reading was written a lifetime ago, a lot has happened since then, including yesterday when I encountered a book that I threw in here that I'm now on chapter 3 of. Wow. It makes me rethink this whole thing. So here's the outline of the lecture. I'm not always going to do this, but I thought I'd try it because other people do it, and I'm jealous of them. So what does the word reflexive mean? Who read it and knows what reflexive means? What does it mean?
To react without thinking, without a conscious thought.
Yeah, so that's one meaning. The doctor hits your knee, and boom, you didn't think, okay, it's time to kick now, he hit my knee, right? It just happens. It's a reflex response. It's automatic. No thinking necessary. As a matter of fact, if you think too hard, it might not happen, right? You might tense up. What's the second, more confusing meaning of the word reflexive? Adaptable is part of it. But it's a secondary, adaptation is a secondary phenomena. What's the other? Yes?
Designing something stable.
Stable.
Yeah.
Does anyone know what this is?
It's a valve or something.
It's a governor and throttle valve. It's back when the world had mechanical systems. It still has mechanical systems, but the faster this spins, there's a belt here. The faster it spins, the more the centrifugal force throws these balls out there, and that increases the resistance to spinning, the angular momentum physics. You took physics, right? But it slows it down. It also, this tends to rotate at a constant rate, and then it further adjusts the throttle valve. It's a governor. It's a reflexive system. One that might be more familiar is the thermostat, although not at Wentworth, right? You very deliberately design the thermostat. Then the user goes to the thermostat and sets it at 71, right? Not 73, not 67, 71, right? There's a design, intentional, conscious, cognitive engagement with the thermostat in two ways. First, the system was designed. Secondly, the user sets the thermostat. And then what happens? We just enjoy the constant stability of the comfort level, right? That is a reflexive system. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind for when we get to the end of this lecture. It comes to this book that I picked up yesterday. This kind of shattered this whole concept a little bit. But this is where the author doesn't get it. It's not just automatic. It's not God. It's not nature. It is human intentional design intervention twice. When it's designed and when it's engaged at the beginning of the heating season, you set your thermostat to heat and you turn it to 71 or 67, depending on whether you care about the future. And then you leave it. Right? There is deliberate human engagement. There's design intention. And then it's automatic. There's something called a negative feedback loop. So if there was no B, it would just turn on, right? It would be an on-off switch. The heat would turn on, and what would happen? We got hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter until you can't stand it anymore. And then you go over and you turn off the switch. And then it would get cooler, 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 right? Who's got time for that? Boring. So in 1883, the thermostat was invented, and we have what's called a negative feedback loop. When it gets too hot, there's all this yes, yes, yes. When it gets too hot, it says no. So it turns off. So that's why it's called a negative feedback loop. The outcome is very beneficial and positive, but it's called a negative feedback loop. What's an example of a positive feedback loop, like in a nuclear power plant? What happens that we don't like in a nuclear power plant?
Reactors overheating.
Reactors overheating, which then
Releases water.
it actually accelerates the reaction. The hotter a nuclear pile is, the faster it creates heat. Sounds like trouble to me, right? So that's what we call a supercritical. That's a positive feedback loop. The hotter it gets, the faster it heats up. And then it melts down to China. That's the China syndrome. So there's a whole history of engineering thinking of negative feedback loops that has percolated into popular thought, in part due to this MIT professor. And these ideas of positive feedback have infiltrated thinking about economics, especially capitalism. And the classic feedback loop, negative feedback loop that everybody loves, everybody's favorite negative feedback loop example is, what is this? Supply and demand. So how does this work? As supply rises beyond demand, you end up with all this stuff on your shelves, right? If you're a manufacturer. And so you drop the price to the point where more people will want it. All of a sudden, when you drop the price, this is a point in the supply line that the price is too high and you have too many things. So you drop the price down to here where people will demand it, and then they start to buy it, and the quantity of things, of products, it starts to go up, or it starts to go down, the quantity as more and more people buy it. But whoa, wait a minute, what happened here? It's out of balance. Too many people bought it, and now there's not enough supply. And so the supply, so there's this balance point. You learned this in high school, I hope. So there's this balance of supply and demand. If you have too many things and not enough demand, the price has to drop. And if you have not enough things and too much demand, the price has to go up. And so in state-sponsored socialism in China and the Soviet Union back in the 20th century, they said, hey, capitalism is evil because it is oppressive. It artificially depresses the value of labor and their wages, and we need to support the workers. We need to boost their wages, and we need to control the price of things by conscious design. This is a case where design apparently can go too far. The evidence of that, the 10 million people who starved to death in the Soviet Union, the 30 million people who starved to death in China. They controlled the price of rice in China to the point where they couldn't afford to produce rice. 30 million people died. This is described very clearly in a book we're going to get to pretty soon. Do you know what Kaizen is? Who's worked in like a corporation? No one's had a job in like a corporation. Total quality improvement. The world of management loves to employ lots and lots of vice presidents, and some of those vice presidents are in charge of improving the culture of the business. And so they have used the cybernetic idea of this negative feedback loop to empower workers to make suggestions on how to improve the production process. This was invented, well, not invented, but it was elevated to prominence by the Japanese in the 70s and 80s. And they took over the automobile market in the United States because they were constantly producing automobiles of a much higher quality and lower cost than Ford and General Motors. And so they used this negative feedback loop idea to become much more profitable and to take over the automobile industry that made us very frightened. And eventually, the U.S. automakers went bankrupt and had to be bailed out by the U.S. government. There's been a lot of popular coverage of something we now call behavioral economics. Who's heard of behavioral economics? Who's heard of Freakonomics? 1, 2. They have a radio show, there's a book, several books. So here's Homer, who's fundamentally lazy. And he gets to the checkout counter and doesn't want to go looking for the circus peanuts back in the back of the store. He just grabs a banana instead because he's fundamentally lazy. He changed the spatial arrangement of choices for the fundamentally lazy customers. and made the path of least resistance a choice that was designed. It's better if people eat fruit, is his theory. And so he makes this the default setting, moves the circus peanuts to the back. Do you guys even know what circus peanuts are? The most disgusting, fill in the blank, whatever your favorite disgusting ho-hos snack is. What's your most disgusting snack?
Cheez-Its.
What are they?
Cheez-Its.
Cheez-Its? That's not so bad. Cheetos? That's not so bad.
Honey buns.
Honey buns? Okay, we're getting closer. So does that make sense? How that would work? Raisin Bran is good for you. So these guys, Collar and Sunstein, I can't remember which one, but they were given an office in the West Wing down the hall from President Obama because their work was so important that Obama said, the Obama administration said, instead of having people check the box that says, yes, I will be an organ donor in the case of my death, and I want to say that on the driver's license, they did things like, check this box if you don't want to be an organ donor, right? Because it turns out most people don't care if their livers get transplanted into someone who will die otherwise. But just like 1% of the population was volunteering to be an organ donor because they have to check a box and they want to do what's normal. So they just change what's normal. The normal thing is, yes, you can have my liver. I don't need it anymore. If you don't want to donate your liver after your death, you got to check a box. You got to put some effort in to protect your liver after your death, right? Pretty smart. Manipulative, but with the most positive of intentions. There's lots of manipulation going on in this world. Not all of it is positively directed. So basically, this way of looking at the world starts to deal with the cat wants to catch the mouse. And that's their motivation. And so they act on that motivation in the environment to catch the mouse. The mouse wants to not get caught by the cat. And so in the environment where there are cats and an architectural arrangement, they operate in the interest of self-preservation. And what actually plays out in the laying out of history is that these two dynamic actors acting in their own self-interest operate and make choices and act aggressively, and either the cat catches the mouse or not, right? And this is a way of modeling the world. What does this have to do with architecture? Does this have anything to do with architecture? Okay. Now, when you did the history theory course, did you learn anything about postmodernism? Was that word ever mentioned? So what did you learn about postmodernism? What do you remember? What's the one thing you remember? Was there a project? Was there an idea? Do you remember a picture? What's embedded in the word itself? Modernism, and what about modernism?
That it came after the modernist movement.
So modernism ended. Is modernism over? It's not?
No.
Then how could we have a postmodernism?
I think it's kind of inspired from the old projects. Yeah, for
Which old?
it's remind me Italy, Rome. Yeah, but I don't remember the project names.
Oh, in Rome.
Yeah.
Oh, the
For,
in New Orleans by Charles Moore, Plaza d'Italia.
and
Is that what it's called?
For example, Boston Public Library.
Boston Public Library.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. She is saving your butts here. So now we can talk. Postmodernism is, okay, this high modern, stripped down stuff is over. We have to go back to historical forms, and even if we make a cartoon version of them, we're adding interest somehow, right? Does that ring a bell? So people like Charles Jenks.
Good movie.
Koyana Statzik, yeah.
Great movie.
Philip Glass did the music. So Charles Jenks said modernism ended, boom, right at that moment when they pushed the button. And he pinpoints it to the second. I can't remember what it is. And he said that was it when the products of modernism were such profoundly mistaken, such big failures, they had to spend even more money to take it down and destroy it because modern architecture just sucks. So Charles Jenks says. But then the reply to Charles Jenks is this documentary film that actually looks at in detail the history of the Pruitt-Igoe projects and makes the point that this was awesome. The people who moved in here loved it. It was a huge improvement on the slums that they had lived in. And then what happened? The city of St. Louis abandoned these housing projects. They stopped maintaining them. The pipes froze. Icicles were streaming down the stairwells, and it became a perfect place for anyone who wanted to deal drugs. And when there was a fire, the fire department would show up, and the drug dealers would shoot at them. The police would show up. They'd shoot at the police. So the fire department refused to respond to any fires. It was pretty bad. And modern architecture in the United States became the poster child of failure. Losers live in public housing designed to the modern style, and people were embarrassed to live in houses of modern style. That's why it's harder to sell a beautiful modern house than it is to sell a colonial whatever in Chestnut Hill in Brooklyn. So the failure of modern architecture turns out to be somewhat of a local phenomena, and I'm overstating this a bit for the sake of time, so we can keep moving forward. So keep in mind that this is a bit of a caricature, and you're welcome, as we move through the semester, you'll hopefully develop a more nuanced approach to this. But for the purposes of this lecture and making the points I need to make, I'm going to present the death of modernism as an exaggeration, as something that is not really as precise as it should be. It's more true in the United States than it is elsewhere. These same buildings are doing great in Singapore, multiple places around Europe. Some of them are failing, like in France, but it seems to be a more intense failure in the United States than elsewhere. The second thing is, it's not modernism so much as high modernism. This post-war, huge top-down planning approach to housing the poor and the homeless was a very rigid system of solving problems, and it did not respond well to problems as they arose. And so they really didn't know what to do except to knock it down. Now, one of the great reference points of understanding that modernism is not over, and it wasn't a failure of modernism so much as a failure of top-down, rigid bureaucratic systems of high modernism in the post-war period. And this guy at Yale wrote this book, which was kind of a wake-up call to planners and architects. He criticizes the Soviet Union, state socialism, the rigidity of that system, causing so many problems in agriculture. China, these statistics I'm giving you come from James C. Scott, and Corbusier. He says that Corbusier, he looks at Corbusier's ideas, and I wish I'm supposed to have a Corbusier picture here. Well, first of all, what's on the cover here? What is that? Do you know what that is? Who's driven across the United States ever? Again. So what happens when you drive across the United States? Like when you get out into Iowa, you get west of the Appalachians and the roads, what happened? You stayed on the super highways because your dad didn't want to. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing. Every few miles, you're on this road and you're going west because you're going to California, right? You're going west. You're going, and for several hours you're just going west, right? And you never have to turn. You're just going on these roads, and all of a sudden the road goes like this. You're like, whoa! Right? It's because there's this sharp turn and then another one. What is that for? Or kill you. What is it for?
To keep you from speeding?
Oh, we'll get to that. Hold that thought. That's in slide 67.
Lot lines.
Think on a larger scale.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like master plan.
Master plan, yeah. Master plan at the scale of a continent.
Is it lot lines?
It's lot lines. Do you know the Jeffersonian grid system? This guy, Thomas Jefferson, who thought of himself as an architect? Well, he also said, hey everybody, let's put a grid across the United States. And let's organize the United States on a grid. And they did that many years later. But what happens when you take a grid and you put it on something? Does that make sense? So this is the classic example of a big top-down idea. Usually you think of maps, right? You look at what the territory looks like and you draw it. And it's a passive relationship between what you're drawing and what the world is. But we know as architects, sometimes we draw something and impose it on the world and the world changes. But who knew that that would be true for a map, right? Really? You draw it on a map and then you change the reality of the world at this scale, even though every year thousands of people die right here. Right there, people die. Right here, people die. But what you gonna do? Right? So that's a classic example of top-down failure, of big planning ideas. These guys, which are in the readings, so I'm not going to go into it, these guys had this idea of postmodernism is not a very useful model for understanding history. They said, no, it's really like we had these rigid systems. And what does the reading say? That really hard sentence in there, ossified, orthodoxy, ossified, hierarchical, hegemonic. What are those? I don't even know what those words mean. Who looked it up?
Just sort of solidified.
Yeah, ossified means to, like, it was liquid and now it's solid. It's like the peanut butter. Right, it doesn't flow anymore. So even the most revolutionary modern ideas, when they become the instruments of state bureaucracies, they become rigid and inflexible, and they ossify, and they have power. Hegemony refers to power, and they and they stop thinking in critical ways. They just say, this is the way we've always done it, and we're just going to do it this way. This is what happens with big planning. This is what happens with Corbusier's ideas about urbanism that we'll be looking at in future weeks. This is what these guys are saying happens in human societies. This is what happened with the whole project of 20th century modernism. And so the question facing your generation and this course and your careers is, what is going to make the 21st century different from the 20th century? And these guys are saying, you need to be reflexive. You need to design systems that are capable of responding fluidly, flexibly, on the fly, the second negative, unexpected consequences emerge. And the things that you identified on Wednesday of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, that's all stuff that emerged. Like, we did the best we could in the 20th century. Who knew that the planet was going to die? Who saw that coming? Like, who could have predicted that? Right? Well, some of us. 1961, Silent Spring, and a bunch of other books. We did predict it. So why couldn't we change course? We couldn't change course because we had ossified hegemonic orthodoxies running the show, and they thought, oh, we can fix anything with a little bit more planning and technology. And we're still doing that. We want to float mirrors into space to reflect back light. Oh my God. So these ideas, these ossified hegemonic orthodoxies are still out there. They're still operating. People who look like me are trying to impose them on people who look like you, and you should be highly critical of it. So the word reflexive in this 1994 publication is a very important thing. Now, what does this have to do with architecture? What's the story of Bilbao? Someone relate this story. What is it?
It was a working class town kind of in decline
Yeah.
until Frank Gehry came.
Until Frank Gehry came in, what did he do? Yeah.
It's now like a huge tourist town.
Yeah. How did Bilbao turn around and become a huge success? Architecture. Thank you. Perfect. Exactly to script. Completely, almost completely inaccurate. This is the myth that architects tell each other and mayors tell each other because they listen to architects. I need to save my town, Baltimore. I'm going to hire Santiago Calatrava to design a museum, right? And that will save my town. And that's been happening ever since Bilbao. It's been happening in city after city, hiring architects to swoop in, save the day, and head out. What's the real story? How dare you downgrade the value of architecture? Don't you realize that that's a betrayal of your profession? And how can you stand up there and teach architects and say that architects aren't important? Here's how. Architects are important. Architecture is essential to the job, but it doesn't operate alone. Okay, I'll say that a few times different ways. The real history of Bilbao is that somewhere in the 1980s, they had a political crisis. They won autonomy so that the tax money that comes out of Bilbao stays in Bilbao. They got control over their budget. And it's all here. They got autonomy in '79. They had new elections. They said, we've got to do something radical. They used some of the money to dredge the port. They built schools. They built transportation systems. They joined, when Spain joined the European Union, Bilbao all of a sudden had access to markets all over Europe. They reinvigorated their industrial base. They had an innovation district. They did all this stuff. They had a university. They had development, they did housing, they did infrastructure, they built a new port, right? How much of that did Frank Gehry do? Zero. He's never heard of Bilbao at this point. Frank Gehry has nothing whatsoever to do with any of this. But then what happens? But is there any architecture in any of this? Tons of architecture. Beautiful mass transit system, beautiful train stations, a complete reinvigoration of their dead port infrastructure into this revitalized innovation district. Tons of architecture happening. The revitalization cannot happen unless it's the story of Bilbao, the more complete story of Bilbao, is it takes a political, economic, social transformation by those in power. It takes a convincing demonstration of the seriousness of their commitment to the transformation, in part by transforming the landscape physically. So the city of Bilbao is transformed physically by committed politicians and bureaucrats committing to transforming the physical environment through high-quality architecture, right? And then the Gehry Museum is the cherry on top of this decades-long effort of lots and lots of architectural planning, political, economic, institutional transformation. That there's a political will, a political commitment, a social commitment to this transformation, and this is the shiny cherry on top. You don't want to do a mediocre building to become the icon. You have to do something flashy. Could Bilbao have been transformed without architecture? No, it could not. Architecture was a fundamentally crucial vehicle to doing a convincing job of transforming Bilbao. This single piece of architecture is very important, but it happened at the very end. This was the cherry on top of something that was happening for a long time. Now, again, this is kind of a very short, blunt caricature, and it's so great to be presenting this lecture at the beginning of the course instead of the end of the course. I'm very proud of this research work. I'm committed to this research work I've been doing for years and years. It's a little unsatisfying to give this lecture at the end of the course because I just drop the mic and we fade to black and the credits roll, and we never talk about it again. And you never address it in your term projects. So it's wonderful and thrilling to present this at the beginning of the course as a challenge to you to verify or contradict the stories I'm telling you. Because everything in this lecture is built on the rest of the course. It used to be teach the course from the dawn of time up to the present, and the conclusions we reach are captured in this lecture. It's thrilling to present this lecture at the beginning instead of the end so that you can engage in
The Basque Country being granted autonomy by the nation state of Spain.
Maybe, but I think it would have taken longer. Does that make sense? Like they wouldn't have had the budget to do these bold things that they did. Other questions? Okay, that's, so I know way too much about the Netherlands to be quick about this, but let's try. So let's do this demonstration. Everyone in the first row, put your fist out and meet the fist of the person, no, the second row. Everyone put their fist out and meet the fist bump the person next to you. Okay. This is the polder dike system of the Netherlands, right? Everyone loves the windmills of the Netherlands. What's going on here? In the 9th century, there was a flood, the North Sea flooded, and it killed a huge number of people in this area. And the obvious thing to do is to leave. And this place is not safe for humans. But some of them said, wait a minute, we can do this. Let's build a ring of dikes. Okay, everybody, build a dike on the sea-facing part of your land. Okay? Thank you very much. Okay, now your well-being depends on the integrity of this dike. And I'm the North Sea, and I'm coming in, and I'm gonna, so what happens, okay, which one of these people do you trust the least to maintain their dike? None of them? So keep in mind that either the North Sea is going to destroy you all, or it's not. It depends on every single one of these individuals, these households. If one of them fails to maintain their dike, you are all toast, right? Okay, you can let go. This completely transformed the political culture of the Netherlands. They suddenly developed a consensus model of governance, a consensus model of decision making, where any single household, because it was all male dominated, could say no, because that was the physical nature of their survival. If one person says, no, I'm not going to maintain my dike, the answer is no, there is no dike protection. So the physical situation of the polder was the fundamental construct by which their political system was developed of consensus. Fast forward 1,000 years. The Netherlands is one of the most successful economies in the world. These are the polders in 2005. These are all the colored areas. These are the different water boards that are each governed according to this consensus process. So they have a completely different political system because of the nature of their designed man-made landscape. And so here you see the development of the Netherlands, which is a very interesting history. 1850, the red are the urban centers, and they get more and more populated, but throughout they're maintaining a lot of agricultural land in what they call the green heart of the Randstad. Is this ring of cities: Rotterdam, Delft, Leiden, Haarlem, Groningen, Amsterdam, Utrecht, etc. And so they realize that what happens in this green heart will determine whether they have food security or not. So there were government regulations that did not allow a lot of development in the agricultural heart. It's interesting to compare this with Los Angeles. The size of the economy is similar, the population is similar, the size is similar to the Los Angeles greater metropolitan area. The physical configuration is completely different. If we had the equivalent representation of Los Angeles, and I'm sorry I don't, it would just be a wash of uniform pink, except where the San Gabriels, the other mountain ranges would make it impossible to build. But it would just be all pink. Just be low density sprawl. This is very high density, concentrated urban centers connected by rail. The road system is a secondary thing. You get around by bicycle and rail. So then they lifted the restrictions, and they during the Reagan-Thatcher period, they said anyone can build anywhere. And then they did some thought experiments. What would happen if the entire green heart were developed according to the model presented by one architectural project called Achtkamp. So if you took the Achtkamp proposal for this one piece of land and you did that to house 1.4 million houses, this is what it would look like. So they started to do extreme scenario testing. This is what if you could only build within 5 kilometers of any train station, which is 5 kilometers, that's the bicycle, the comfortable bicycling distance. Then the pattern would look like that. And they did all these extreme scenario testing. This was in the 90s. And so this was a way of not allowing what happened in the United States to happen here. In the United States, and we'll look at this in detail, so I'm not going to go deep. In the United States, we said, oh, a suburban house, awesome. High value in the market. Let's let people buy those. Well, the consequences of the post-war suburbanization of the United States has a very strong correlation with planetary death, to say it again bluntly. And so they said, well, we don't want that to happen. We're not the United States. We're one of the highest density populations in the world. That would destroy our food security. We can't allow the US-style suburbanization of the Netherlands. So let's not just design a house or a subdivision and let market forces carry it away to its logical conclusion. Let's be deliberate. Let's look at what the consequences would be if we did this everywhere. And so they did that. And this is a famous demonstration in Rotterdam at the Netherlands Institute for Architecture, where they, Adrian Gauza, the principal, the Harvard-educated principal of West 8. Have you heard of West 8? They designed the housing islands in Amsterdam Harbor. Anyway, he lectures in Cambridge a lot. So the planning authority of the Netherlands said, between now, and this was in the mid-90s, between now and 2020, we are going to need, I can't remember the number, but a lot of houses. And so Adrian Gauza said, okay, let's look at what that looks like. If we did a US-style housing boom to provide all the houses that were needed, what would that look like? I think it's 390,000. And what if we invited a lot of architects to try making different patterns and propose arrangements that are sensible and high quality and designed well? And the conclusion is, the point of this demonstration is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how high quality the houses are. It doesn't matter how high quality the arrangements are. The outcome is unacceptably bad. It's just not okay. And so this was a demonstration. Well, I shouldn't say that because that's the name of what it's demonstrating. This is a clear example of the demonstration effect. Like, I could tell you with no visual evidence. I could say, if you build lots of houses, it almost doesn't matter whether the design is good or bad. The overwhelming reality is that there are lots of houses. Like, I could say that with my mouth, but it's not the same as saying it when you're looking at this. And this is the fundamental principle of what we do in architecture. What I call Missouri rules. Missouri is the show me state. In my studios, you're not allowed to say anything that you're not showing us. Remember that? You're not allowed to show anything. You're not allowed to say anything that you're not showing. Don't say it unless you can demonstrate it. That's the idea behind the analysis assignment. That's the idea behind Bruce Mau's exhibition of massive change. We got to do something about the challenges of the 21st century. Bruce Mau is the designer of Rem Koolhaas's small, medium, large, extra large book. Another Dutch spin-off is the firm MVRDV, Winnie Maas, Vinnie Maas. This book is FAR Max. What does FAR stand for? Thank you, floor area ratio. And so they said, what if, it was a similar extreme scenario testing that I quickly buzzed past, which was, what if the entire population of the human species were placed in a 1 kilometer cube, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer? What would that look like? Extreme scenario, crazy. What if we looked at all of the trash, all of the coal we burn, all of the products that are consumed? What would it look like? And so this was a whole thing of data visualization. There's a data visualization kind of industry. Have you heard of Tufte, Edward Tufte? Who's heard of Edward Tufte? Okay, Edward Tufte is the father of information design. And back in the 90s, he wrote 3 books. And it became very convincing that we need to be more effective in the way we convey information. It was basically an independent verification of what the Dutch were doing, which was you need to make these things visually, physically apparent before you can really grasp it, to really understand these quantities. And it's connected with, and now we're at slide 67, it's connected with the reflexive response of people. When you see these big things, you're like, oh, wow, that's a lot of trash that one city produces. You know, you can tell people that your city produces a lot of trash, or you can show them how much trash they produce, as opposed to how much recycling. And they go, oh, you know, there's this visceral human physical response to the demonstrations of these things. It's reflexive. Now, what's this? It's a parking lot for children to play in, which is such a Dutch thing to do, right? Remember, the Netherlands is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. It has very dense cities. It doesn't have a lot of cars, but the cars that it has, they have to keep them somewhere. And in the US, we just, convert some cornfields to parking and put a shuttle bus to Longwood from the surface parking to Wentworth. It's just land, who cares? It's not worth anything, right? Here, the land is precious. You can't afford to just have a parking lot in front of your house. You need a place for your children to play. So this is called a woner. Woon is the Dutch word for living. Erf, I don't know what that means. Woner. It's basically a playground parking lot. The people driving through here drive slowly, in part because there's a tree there. There's cobblestones that feel like it's a pedestrian zone. There are these bollards to protect these areas. There are plantings, there are street lamps, there are trees. It's narrow. There are children present. They drive no faster than the walking pace. It's so un-American. An American would say, it is my God-given right to drive 60 miles an hour in a parking lot, if I so choose. And by the way, free parking. It's in the Bill of Rights, right? What's this? So we could put up a traffic sign and say 25 mile an hour speed limit. And the police would enforce it would they? No, they don't care. How fast, can you go faster than the speed limit in the US? You have to, or else you're gonna get honked at, okay? If you're here in the US, do not go the speed limit. Go at least 10 miles an hour faster. And look up every 10 or 15 seconds from your text messaging just to see if there's any police around, right? But we can't do that in the Netherlands. There are children playing here. And we can't afford, who wants to put police officers on every corner? In Asia, they put concrete sculptures of police officers. Just so out of the corner of your eye, say, oh shit, and you slow down. But here, what do we do?
Switch the roads.
What do we do?
You're combining the roads.
It's not, it's almost a speed bump, but it's not. It's called
Chicane.
a chicane? Is that what you said? Yeah, it's a chicane. Chicane. What else do we use? Are there any more? No. We have lots of tricks now that we use, and we've started to do it in the United States, right? Have you seen these things?
But this is not a one-way.
This is not a one-way.
So how do two cars fit in that left side?
They have less cars, so you have one person stop and then the other person go through and then the other person.
I know, right? This is the stupidest thing ever, right? But it's a way, they could put up a sign and say one at a time, but they don't have to. The physical built environment gives everyone the messages they need to manage the flow of traffic, including pedestrians. The whole point of this is to shorten the path for my 3-year-old daughter, right, who can walk to daycare on her own because this is there. And by the way, state-sponsored daycare in the Netherlands, right? So, and what happens the first time that Jackie gets to this intersection? What does she do? She goes, ah, right? This is bullshit, right? What happens the 5th time Jackie gets to this intersection? She doesn't even think about it. Okay, this 10th time. The 10th time Jackie gets here, she's just like, she just continues texting. She stops here, lets another go, and just, you know, right? So, what do we call that? We've identified this. What's the word for this kind of system behavior? It becomes a norm. It becomes reflexive. Thank you. Right? It becomes reflexive. There are ways to design the built environment to mobilize and activate reflexive human responses. Is it manipulative?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Is it a beneficial outcome? Mostly. There are pros and cons, right? It slows Jackie down. She's trying to get to work. But so she just wakes up earlier next time, right?
Or she takes a bike.
No, Jackie's not. Let's be reasonable. So here we are. This looks like Harlem to me. The one with 2 A's. Wonerf, right? It's awesome. Who's this guy? This is Hans Motorman. His idea, if you think this traffic calming thing is insane, wait till you hear this guy's idea. He was the traffic planner for a small town in the Netherlands. I can't remember the town. He said, you know that intersection in the middle of the city with the traffic lights and the left turn lane and the yield sign and all that, where people keep getting hurt? The reason people keep getting hurt is because there's a green arrow saying, sure, turn left. And so drivers say, I have the right of way. Right? And pedestrians get taken out in the crosswalk. And they tried everything. They put delays, they put lights, people kept getting hit. And so he said, okay, enough's enough. Let's remove the traffic light altogether. Let's remove the stop sign, the yield sign. Let's remove, I don't know why there's a crosswalk here. Let's remove the crosswalks. Let's remove the lines that say that's your side and this is my side. Let's just erase all evidence of traffic management and guidelines. So now what happens the first time Jackie comes into this intersection? She kills her. But when she gets out of jail and she's going in there again, she's going, well, I'm not going to do that again, right? And so she's like, she's making eye contact with the pedestrians. And what are the pedestrians doing? They're making eye contact with the drivers. How often do pedestrians run into each other, right, and get hurt? Very rare. How? What is that? What are we doing? What's the magic of pedestrians not running into each other? We have a reflexive response to other humans, and we dodge them. We say, after you. So we do that, and we do it through social reflexive mechanisms that have been developed over 200,000 years, right? So why should drivers be any different? We're going to do a reading about why drivers should be different. But isn't that interesting? The Netherlands, because of to recap the principles here, because the Netherlands is an insane place to live, the North Sea floods it. Because the Netherlands is impossible to manage, there's not enough land, everything's so dense, it's so impossible to manage that you shouldn't attempt to manage it from the top down unless you can activate the reflexive mechanisms of the Dutch residents, right? So in conditions of extreme hardship and extreme challenge, the Dutch have mobilized these reflexive human responses through their system design, through the design of their landscape, through their political systems, through their traffic management systems, through mixed uses of parking, playground, and just continues. Everything is mixed. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go to Medellin by way of Curitiba, Brazil. You've heard of bus rapid transit? Right? Who's ridden the Silver Line? Silver Line is bus rapid transit. It was invented by an architect by the name of Jaime Lerner, who entered a competition for the urban design of the city of Curitiba, Brazil, in the 1970s. His team lost the competition, but it mobilized his belief that the transformation of the city of Curitiba was essential to, in part, avoid the perils of the United States, of suburban sprawl and automobile dependence. And so he lost the competition, so what did he do? What should you do when you lose the design competition?
Try again.
You should run for mayor. So he was elected, and he implemented his proposal, his team's proposal, one of which was to say, we need a subway system. We can't afford a subway system. So what should we do? We should do a much cheaper subway. We need something that's 1/100th the cost of the subway system per kilometer, but works almost as well as a subway. So he designed a new approach to bus, and it is the bus rapid transit system. Every city in the world now has a bus rapid transit system either implemented or on the books, because it costs 1/100th the cost of a subway, but it's about 50% as effective and efficient as a subway. That was an architect. So Curitiba did it. Bogota did an even more elaborate bus rapid transit system in conjunction with traffic calming, with bicycle networks, with zoning controls, with architectural, high-quality architectural design. Who's heard of Medellin, Colombia? We've all heard of it because we did the reading, right? But who knows, what's the name of the guy from Medellin who they made a series about?
Pablo Escobar.
Pablo Escobar. You've heard of Pablo Escobar? Have you seen Narcos?
Fire show.
It's what? Good show?
Yeah, it's okay.
Well, Pablo Escobar, so season 1 of Narcos was like here, right? And by the end of it, right, they catch him at the end of season 1?
2, I think.
No.
No, they catch him at the end of the beginning when they put him in jail and then he breaks
Or
out.
when they kill him.
When they kill him.
Spoilers.
Season 2. Okay, season 1. Season, yeah, season.
He's already dead.
So this is like season 2. So this is the Narcos graph. And this is where they kill Escobar, and I think Don Berna takes over, right, in season 3. And so this is season 3. This is the death rate in Colombia. 50-year-long violent revolution, guerrillas with machine guns in the forests, in the jungle, shooting up things. But it's really about the drug cartels. And if you haven't, who's seen Narcos? Okay. So you get the idea. Medellin, Colombia, what's the most violent city in the world right now?
Chicago.
Chicago is the most violent city in the United States. Syria is pretty high. Somewhere. What's it?
El Salvador.
Oh, close.
Brazil, the capital of Brazil. Rio de Janeiro.
Rio? Rio is up there.
Liberia.
I think Rio's like 50 deaths per 100,000. But I think, what's the G country near El Salvador?
Guatemala.
Yeah.
I was gonna say Honduras.
What are you going to say?
Honduras.
Honduras. I think, what's the G country?
Guatemala.
Guatemala. I think Guatemala is now the highest. Who's got Google? So the murder, it flips around, right? Mexico City,
Caracas, Venezuela.
Caracas, yes, okay. I'm not surprised that they. So how many deaths per 100,000? That's how we.
119.87.
No way. 119.
130 out of 10,000.
100,000.
Yeah,
100,000. So 130 out of. So the most violent place in the world right now, Caracas, Venezuela. 130 murders per 100,000 population. Phew. Nothing. Nothing compared to Medellin in 1992. Almost, just let's call it 400. We're all friends here, right? Let's just round it off. 400 murders per 100,000 people in 1 year. Okay? That's the background to this. So I said the Netherlands was in this desperate situation, and they had to be extremely innovative to survive at all. And thus, the design in the Netherlands has become a very important factor in their survival. Now, what happened here? How did it get turned around? Right, they captured Escobar. Don Berna took over. Did drugs go away? Did the drug cartels just vanish?
No.
No, they're still there. The gangs are there. They're still, but the drug gangs are incorporated into left and right wing urban military groups, and it's just more controlled, right? And I think there's a little bit of this going on, but that's where we are. This is when I moved there with my family.
Moved where?
Medellin.
You live there?
I lived there. I took a sabbatical, and I moved to Medellin so that I could give you this lecture better. So Sergio Fajardo, you read the reading, right? That was me writing in, when did I write that? 2010. So that was me writing in 2010. And I have all these questions, and Fajardo came here to Wentworth. You caught that, right?
Yeah.
So Fajardo was elected mayor in 2004 by a landslide. He completely transformed Medellin through the campaign, and then 4 years of being mayor. And by the way, he can't run for re-election. There's a term limit. He only gets 4 years, and that's all he gets. So what does he do? He gets elected, and he starts building library parks, renovating schools, building these cable car systems. And he starts to convince people through architectural intervention that he's not kidding. He's serious about this. He's serious about stopping the corruption that used to steal hundreds of millions of dollars every year, just lost to corruption. And instead of losing that money to corruption, he builds these things. He builds the cable car. He builds the library parks, right? But he only has 4 years to do it. So he builds all of this stuff really fast. So my question to him when he came here, actually before he came here, I met him with Manuel Delgado. We went and had lunch with him in Harvard Square. And he's this young, he looked like a graduate student. He had a backpack and blue jeans, and he's coming down the stairs. And so we sit down with him, and I say, "Where'd the money come for all this?" And he says, "We just stopped stealing it. And we kept the campaign promise." So a few weeks after he ended his first term of mayor, he declares his candidacy. The first thing he does is he declares that he's running for president of Colombia. The next thing he does that's worth telling in this story is he came to Wentworth to be the keynote speaker of the Designing for Life Symposium, where we're trying to figure out what the hell is going on here with this, all this stuff. And there he is in Watson Hall. And he says that there was a plan to do a high-speed, high-capacity subway system in the 80s, and his predecessor built it. So there was a high-speed, high-capacity subway, heavy rail system that moves a lot of people up and down this river valley. And there was a plan in Poblado, which is where I lived, where all the rich people live, to have a really cool cable car so that people didn't have to come. This is the valley, and these are very, very steep mountain slopes. You saw it in the beginning credits in Narcos. Dun, 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 right? Steep mountains. And so they were going to put a cable car so the rich people in Poblado could get to the subway station easier. And he said, "Sorry, rich people, we're going to put you guys on hold. We're going to put a pin in the map every time we find a dead body.
What?
And then we're going to stand back from the map, and we're going to squint our eyes, and we're going to look at where the most pins are. And then we're going to build a cable car and a library park in Santo Domingo, where Escobar's activities were at their height. And this is where this is where the most bodies were piling up. And so they cleared the ruins there because no one lived there. And they built this library park. Now, hermetically sealed boxes, big form, a lot of problems. But it worked anyway. They gave dignity to the neighborhood. So here's an example of an analysis. And basically, the process of this is to say, okay, so what? What matters here? Here's architecture, here's a site, here's a situation, here's a setting with a lot of problems. What does architecture do, and how does it do it? You have to analyze it and explain it. So we probably should have highlighted these things. First of all, it's big, bold, expensive, world-class architecture won through an international design competition funded by the King of Spain. This is the King of Spain Library Park. So big architecture that screams money, wealth, dignity, power. But it's not just a library. It houses all kinds of services, daycare, lending, financial management classes, cooperative. It's basically a community center. It's the center of everybody here. They kept the housing untouched. For 60 years, aid organizations have been swooping in on places in trouble. And step one, what do we do? What's the first thing we do in slums? We demolish it, right? Then step two,
Build new slums.
we do nothing for 30 years. And then if there's still a welfare state, then maybe we build housing and we use it to pack people in like Pruitt-Igoe. So learning the lessons of Pruitt-Igoe, Sergio Fajardo said, we're going to leave the housing. We only have 4 years. We're going to build 5 of these library parks. We're going to connect it so that people, instead of taking 2 hours to get downtown, they can get downtown in a half hour. This is connected to the subway station, and all of a sudden they have access to jobs, social connections, church. In the library park, in the library, there are kids accessing computers the same way that my kids do in Cambridge. The parents of these kids were children in the 90s hiding under the beds. Their parents wouldn't let them come from out from under the beds because the stray bullets would rip right through the walls. And there were only 2 kinds of children. Children who were hiding under the beds or children who died. And those are the only 2. Those who survived, their children are surfing the web. So again, what do you do in these analysis? You say this is very important. The way these things work to, so you highlight these moments of truth where you can't see it, but this is where people are gathering. I think there's a music performance going on right here. I think that's another place. The people are crucial in this scenario, and the connection across to the cable car station. It should be zoomed out a little more. These hermetically sealed boxes are not great, but fortunately there's a gap between them. That is a very important moment of truth in this architecture, worth highlighting. So my question to Fajardo was, you did all these things, 120 school renovations in 4 years, 5 library parks in 4 years. You can't tell me that this isn't the same top-down planning, the government saying, we know it's good for you and just doing it. What makes what you did any different than that? And here was his answer. And I spent several months living there, checking this out to see whether he was being accurate or not. They didn't just design it. I don't know about you, but when I went to architecture school, my professors told me, never show your client more than one scheme. Your job as the architect is to come up with a brilliant solution and present it, unveil it to your clients, and basically tell them to take it or leave it. You're the artist, right? What do your professors tell you? Do they say something like that? Or do they say, you need to iterate. You need to draw it, and then you need to critique it. And if there are other people who are involved in the design, then you should involve them in the critique process, right? So that's basically what happened in Medellin. They didn't just design it, come in, and impose it. They did just design it in the scope of international competition. So it was a done deal design. But then they presented it to the people in the neighborhood as the clients. The mayor was not the client. The poorest people in the poorest neighborhood of Medellin, they were given the authority to embrace or reject everything the architects proposed. And one of the things they rejected is this whole part of the design. They said, no, We don't want what you did. We need an auditorium. And then we need another space outside the auditorium for our children to have these activities. So they all of a sudden were given the privileges of client status. They could accept or reject what the architects were proposing. These libraries are the centers of everything. They put in these boxes. There are all these groups. Family planning, security, the local police, the source of small loans, used goods, the artist communities. So this becomes the clubhouse of all the social organizations, and it became a very safe place. It's like the hill town in Italy where I spent my honeymoon with my wife. It's a lovely place to hang out. So here's another school, What Matters. They kept the housing the same. They connected it with, they paved the road. It was a rutted dirt path. Now they have a dirt road that connects them down to where they can catch the cable car. And then they get this beautiful school, and they don't wall it off. This becomes a permeable edge so that people can come straight to this high school, a colegio. Beautiful architecture, high quality design all the way through. There are still gangs, there's still violence, but this is Comuna 13, the District 13. This is from my drone. I have to show this. I went through so much to try to get my drone to do something useful. I'm not sure it did. I don't know. But they built, in order to connect these people down to the extension of the train system, they built a series of escalators that go all the way up the hill. You can't quite see it because I'm not a very good drone pilot. But it's a very difficult place to photograph well. And I was nervous about knocking on the door of people saying, "Excuse me, I'm a drone pilot from the United States. My drone is on your roof." Because the last time, the U.S., Narcos, there are a lot of U.S. agents flying over Medellin. I didn't want to be one of those guys.
You just walk away from it.
I was very careful about where I flew it. So this was my favorite library park. It's completely integrated with the neighborhood. No time. But this becomes their neighborhood. They use it for spontaneous gatherings. They're learning this kind of martial arts dancing thing that they do in Brazil, but here they are doing a Colombian version of it. But the thing that's worth noticing here is there's no wall between the informal settlement housing that we're going to study next week and this community center that we call a library park, for lack of a better term. So, no time. Well, here's an analysis. What matters? Well, they left the neighborhood as is, but they built, it's not just an escalator, it's an escalator with associated infrastructure. School groups meet here, clubs meet here. There was some kids learning dance, traditional dance forms in this 2 levels. I have lots of other video and photographs of it. They built basketball courts, playground area, just any little space, right there, any little space. And they created this infrastructure that allows people over here to get to this part of the escalator. And so it's about connection. This is in Caracas, Caracas is where they invented the Metro Cable, the cable car idea for connecting people to the slums. But it was built first in Medellin. There's a very strong design connection between Caracas and Medellin, which is where Wentworth is connected with all of this, because we have Manuel Delgado. And Manuel is connected to this joint design community between Caracas and Medellin. And our hope is to have a third meeting of Designing for Life, bringing the people up from Caracas and Medellin to Boston, to Wentworth, to figure out, be poised and ready when the situation in Caracas opens up for design intervention. We'll be able to support the transformation of Caracas in a way that follows or builds on the experiences of Medellin. So this is very much a real project. Here we see Parasopolis. This is a very famous photograph by now. What I often do is I just show you this half and I say, ooh, that's pretty cool, right? Pools on the balcony, awesome. A- or A, right, in studio, pretty cool. But how does it change when you realize that this is the situation in which it's placed? Right? This defensive wall gets hot pink because this is the fundamental condition that absolutely condemns this as not so pretty. The security guards patrolling this wall have to be extra vigilant, and they have to be heavily armed because of the violence that it imposes on this. These people, this used to be all people's houses, and they weren't great houses, but they had a place to live until the developer paid off the politician. Their housing was bulldozed, those people were displaced, and this luxury housing was installed. This neighborhood is next. So the social violence of this intervention stands in sharp contradiction. So just to summarize, is it planning or is it design? This is the question of the century, I think. Planning didn't work so well. But wait, what about Singapore? A quick review of the history of Singapore. Like the Netherlands, like Medellin, it faced extreme hardship. In 1965, Malaysia said, you know, Singapore, you're worse than Calcutta. You have so much poverty, a bunch of Chinese people. We don't want you. You are no longer part of the nation of Malaysia. Can you imagine if that happened to Boston? If Donald Trump announced, Boston, you know what? You're a pain in the butt. You're no longer part of the United States. That's essentially what happened. Singapore was ejected from Malaysia. It had extreme poverty. And what did they do? Lee Kuan Yew went on TV. He was the senator from the province of Singapore serving in the Malaysian parliament. He went on TV with tears streaming down his face saying, we've been ejected from Malaysia. We're on our own. They expect us to die. He was elevated to prime minister. He transformed the housing. He built public housing, a lot like Pruitt-Igoe. And today, 86% of the population of Singapore lives in very high quality public housing. They've manipulated it so it's not called public housing, but it essentially, for all intents and purposes, it's public housing, 99-year lease public housing.
It's also the greenest city on the planet, and by 2020, every single person in Singapore will live within 400 meters of a park. It's completely transformed itself.
And now it's, and Dubai, whatever tricks Dubai learned, it learned by looking at Singapore. Right? So watch out, Dubai. The formula for Dubai is, hey, make a state-of-the-art, make the best airline in the world, the best airport in the world, make it a hub of people traveling through, and make it the only choice for doing business in the region. So Singapore is a counter-argument. It's complete tyranny. It's top-down planning, absolute design. I'm Lee Kuan Yew. I went to Oxford. I know what's best for this new nation of Singapore, and but it's the same as Bilbao and Medellin and the Netherlands. You can't do anything well unless you bring in the built environment and you design it very high quality. They integrated the the mass transit system with the housing system, so people wouldn't have to buy cars. They could walk from their apartments to the subway station, the MRT, and then go anywhere in the island. So that was a key part of it. But still, it was not this reflexive thing. It was more top-down. So that's an inconsistency in the story. I want to give that to you. Now, Douglas Spencer, yesterday morning I was just opening my email, and there's a book review by someone, Carl Nightingale, about this book. I'm in chapter 3 now. He's saying you can only have two things. You can either have top-down planning, or you can have reflexive operation of capitalism along neoliberal lines. Top-down planning may be a problem, but neoliberal capitalist operations is evil. They use market forces to perpetuate the rules. Why is the world such a mess right now? What are the reflexive mechanisms operating in the world that explains why it's such a mess? Well, correct me if I'm wrong at some point during the semester, but my reading of it is the rules of the game are this. Whoever pillages the planet and its people most violently and most aggressively, whoever dumps the most pollution into the atmosphere, whoever clear cuts the most forests, strip mines the most coal, sucks out the most oil, whoever pillages the wilderness most violently gets the most money, right? It's easy to say this because look who's Secretary of State, right? Those are the rules. If you can establish a monopoly to relieve yourself of any reflexive mechanism of supply and demand, you win. Let's go. So if those are the rules of the game, how could you not have the outcomes that we're seeing? And when you look at these plans for the future of architecture, you see images like this. Ooh, solar panels, lots of green, vertical agriculture, rich white people, right? It's lovely. It's lovely. And here's another reflexive architecture, right? This is architecture that's responding to the presence of the human body. Awesome, so cool, so reflexive. But what's the point? Right? It's just cool. It is cool, but it's just cool. It doesn't respond according to rules that are going to help. There's not a beneficial negative feedback loop in this reflexive architecture. It's very cool. Across the river at MIT, Mark Goldthorpe. He doesn't have to lock it in Second Life. He can do it with computers and Arduino boards, and awesome, very cool, very responsive, very reflexive. But so what, right? What does it do? Philip Beasley. Let's go beyond Arduino boards and electrical motors. Let's incorporate fluids and thermal sensors and systems that use osmosis and emulate animated biological organisms. Also, very cool, right? It's very cool. But it doesn't, it's not connected, it's reflexive in a way, but it's not connected to some of these larger issues of whether there's benefits or not. The last point has to do with how games can change things. So right now we create these designs and we lock them in the CAD file, and we print them out and we present them to clients and they get built. We do the same thing at the scale of cities, neighborhoods and cities. We come up with these big plans, we publish these thick books, we propose these big infrastructure projects, but there's no responsive, there's no design of a thermostat-like mechanism when things start to go wrong, like if there's social disparities that emerge, if there's a political outcry, there's no way to respond. There's no reflexive mechanism to correct course, like there was in Medellin. And so some planners, first and foremost, Buckminster Fuller. Who's heard of Buckminster Fuller? The geodesic dome? Dymaxion map. So he came up with something called the world game. Basically, he said, this stuff is too important and too complex to leave to planning. Planning comes up with one scenario, and you're done. It needs to operate like a game. One person makes a move, and the whole system changes to adjust to that move. Now the second person makes a move, again, the whole system changes to respond to that move. It can't work if you have a static plan. You have to have a dynamic model that is capable of responding in real time to what's going on. So this has been happening. MVRVD, Winnie Moss has done this computer organized game. This is my last slide. I'm sorry this took so long. The business school at Stanford, right? Are they called the B School? No, they've rebranded themselves the D School. The business school at Stanford and other business schools have followed suit. They've said, design is where it's at. The design thinking method of iteration, criteria, method, testing, the studio model of education is what they do now at the business school in Stanford. They've rebranded themselves the design school because they use design thinking processes to educate, and they're proposing it as the model for managing institutions and organizations in the future. So with that, Ali, do you have, if you only had 3 minutes to say something, what would you say?
Well, I would just reiterate what you said for the last 2 hours, more or less.
So do you have any questions about how to do this analysis? Do you want to see more examples?
Can you post examples too?
We have 3 minutes left. So this is the kind of view you want to get. It's an elevated perspective. It's an elevated view. It places in the foreground an architectural space where humans can be seen experiencing actual architectural space that has been formed by some urban form. You also see the situation in which it's placed. You have available all kinds of patterns of urban form in the larger context. In a single image, you see the larger context and the specific architectural performance of urban form in that context. This is a very poorly highlighted image. The colors are too dark. It's incomplete. They use polyline where they should be using the magnetic pixel for pixel tool. They should blow up. And these overlays need to be transparent. If I were going to say, if I were going to do a diagram version of that one thing, I would say poor people live on this side of the wall, rich people live on this side of the wall. That's just a stupid diagram. It's not a test. You would have to see that image of the fancy spiral balcony and the informal settlements. Similarly, you need the architectural evidence to be legible. You're not just asserting it. You're speculating. You're saying, I think this is true. You're inviting your readers to confirm, to verify whether it is your speculation is correct. This one is much better in that the colors are more subtle. the highlighting matches pixel for pixel the evidence of the physical reality of the place. This is a much more skillful, it takes more time to achieve that kind of fidelity, or you need to do it with a highlighter pen. But these are, as students are doing this, they're trying to figure things out. It's not a slam dunk diagram. They're testing, they're looking for patterns, and they're speculating on the relationship between different things. It starts with the Sesame Street exercise. One of these things is not like the other. Remember that? And then, so you identify things that are of one type, and you highlight them one color. Then you look for differences, and then you look at the architectural scale transitions between these different things, like the wall between this and that, right? Does that make sense? Questions? I will post examples. I will post some videos so you see what's expected of you to create a screen capture video that it shows the step-by-step evolution of your analysis. So as you do the analysis, save versions of it so you can do step 1, this stuff. Step 2, look at this. Step 3, and so you can narrate the analysis in a 1-minute video. It will make more sense if you reread the syllabus instructions and look at the examples we give. But are there any questions that you can anticipate?
So is that an option of analysis, is the 1-minute video, or is that
No.
required?
This is a required thing. You're choosing a high-resolution image. You are manipulating it in phases. You are capturing the different phases of that manipulation. You are drawing conclusions and capturing those conclusions in a 120-word paragraph. It says, 1, public housing in New York City in the 50s was built on the idea of Corbusier's tower in the park. Right? That's the first sentence is where we're all in agreement. That's the history. The second part is, say, although there was a vast accommodation for green space, a lot of that green space was abandoned and neglected. This is telling a different story because it was privatized, condoized, and made very, very expensive in the 90s. But it's a 60-second, 120-word narrative of what you discover along the way when you're manipulating this piece of evidence. Read those instructions again. You're going to do it 9 times, and you're going to fail in fairly large ways the first time you do it. The second time you do it, you should fail less, etc. Thank you.